The candles were still burning when my mother realized I'd brought the one thing she'd spent 9 years trying to make disappear. First Cornerstone Church smelled like pine and hot wax. The whole congregation was on its feet, clapping, because Pastor Gaines was lifting a green sash that read Cornerstone Pillar and reaching toward my father's neck. My dad stood at the front like a man being knighted. My mom sat in the first pew with her gloved hands folded, smiling the smile she wore for the town. Then I stood up in the back row, a thin envelope in my hand, and her smile froze halfway to her eyes. 1 year before, in a parking lot full of snow, my family had handed me a suitcase. Tonight, I'd come back holding theirs. What I was about to say would empty that room in 4 minutes. But to understand how I ended up standing in that church with my daughter's whole life sealed in an envelope, you have to go back to the Christmas before, to a suitcase, a snowbank, and the words my mother used like a door clicking shut. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, where the people everyone underestimated finally get the last word, and the truth outlasts every reputation built to bury it. I'm Drea. If a quiet person standing up for her child is the kind of story you stay for, drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. A year earlier, my whole world fit inside a small rented house on Pearl Street, and I paid for that world in night shifts. I'm an emergency room nurse. I'd come home at 7 in the morning, still smelling like antiseptic, and there my daughter Maya would be. 8 years old, lining up her cereal bowls by color because she liked order the way I did. We were good at small. We were good at quiet. The catch was that the house on Pearl Street belonged to my parents, and they never once let me forget it. Rent went straight into my father's account, and every repair came with a sermon. I changed my own porch lights and still got a call about the bulb wattage. People at the hospital thought I had it together. And I did. Mostly. I could run a code, hold a stranger's hand while they died, chart it clean, and clock out steady. What I couldn't do was figure out why a woman who could keep an entire ward calm had to ask permission to repaint her daughter's bedroom. I told myself it was just how my family worked. I told myself a lot of things on those drives home. Maya never asked for much. She asked for pancakes on Sundays, and for me to braid her hair the slow way, and she asked, sometimes, about her grandparents. Why we never stayed long, why the photos in their farmhouse never had her face in them. I'd smile and change the subject and turn up the radio. I was a person who fixed things for a living. I just hadn't let myself look straight at the one thing in my life that was broken on purpose. That winter, I was about to find out exactly how broken and exactly who'd done the breaking. Sunday dinners at my parents' farm were a performance, and Maya and I were the part they wished they could cut. The Offutt place sat 12 minutes outside town, a white farmhouse with a glass cabinet in the front room where my mother displayed the family. Bryn's wedding portrait, Bryn's college graduation, my father shaking hands with the mayor. There was a school photo of me from before everything, and there was nothing, not one frame, of Maya. I noticed it the way you notice a missing tooth with your tongue, over and over, unable to stop. That night, my mother set Maya's plate at the corner of the table, away from the others, and called it more room for her elbows. My father barely looked at my daughter. When Maya reached for the rolls, he watched her hand like it might leave a mark on the bread. Maya was sweet about all of it. She said please and thank you in her clear little voice and complimented my mother's gravy. And my mother said, "Isn't that nice?" to the air above her head. Then Maya went to wash up, and my father set down his fork. He said it plainly, the way he'd say the weather. No grandchild of mine wears that face. The kitchen went quiet. My mother kept eating. I felt the old reflex rise, the one that wanted to smooth it over, keep the peace, get through dessert. Instead, I stared at the empty space in that cabinet and understood, for the first time clearly, that the emptiness was a decision someone made and dusted every week. I drove Maya home to Pearl Street that night with her humming in the back seat, oblivious, and I gripped the wheel and promised myself I'd protect her from knowing what I'd just heard. I had no idea how soon that promise would be tested. If you'd asked anyone in town about me, They'd have said I was the reliable one, and they'd have meant it as both a compliment and a leash. I was the daughter who showed up. When my father's gutters clogged, I climbed the ladder. When my mother's blood pressure spiked, I drove her to the cardiologist and translated everything the doctor said. I picked up extra shifts to cover the rent on a house I lived in but would never own. I told myself this was love, the doing kind, the kind that doesn't need to be said. The truth was simpler and harder. I was over-responsible the way some people are overtired, chronically, without noticing the cost. I had built my whole sense of worth out of being useful, because useful was the one thing my family had ever rewarded me for. I didn't have many friends. Night shift eats your social life, and shame eats the rest. You don't invite people into a life you're embarrassed by. So I poured everything into Maya and the hospital, and I let my parents collect the interest. Looking back, that was my weakness. And it wasn't softness. It was a kind of pride dressed up as duty. I believed if I just carried enough, did enough, never made a scene, the cabinet in the front room would eventually make space for my daughter's face. I believed people earn their way into being loved. It took me years and one freezing parking lot to learn that some doors stay shut no matter how much you carry through them. But that winter, I was still climbing ladders, still translating cardiologists, still telling myself the next Sunday might be the one where my father looked at Maya and saw a child instead of a verdict. The next thing my family did would cure me of that hope for good. To understand my parents, you have to understand what they worshipped, and it wasn't exactly God, it was standing. My mother ran the garden club and sat third pew on the aisle every Sunday, and my father's hardware store had supplied half the farms in the county for 30 years. Their religion was being respectable in a town small enough to keep score. That December, the church held its holiday social, and I watched the whole machine run. My mother floated through the fellowship hall introducing my sister Bryn and Bryn's husband, Preston Hale, whose family owned the local bank. "You know the Hales," she'd say, beaming, a hand on Preston's arm. When she got near me and Maya, the introduction stopped. We became furniture. A woman from the garden club asked my mother kindly whether this was her granddaughter, and my mother said, "Drea helps at the hospital," as if that were an answer, and steered the woman away. Maya was holding a cookie she hadn't bitten yet, watching the grown-ups, learning something I didn't want her to learn. I knelt down and told her the cookies were better at home, and we left early. In the parking lot, Maya asked why Grandma talked about everybody but us. I didn't have a clean answer, so I gave her the dishonest one. I said Grandma was just busy. The thing about a town like ours is that reputation is currency, and my parents had spent 40 years saving up. They would protect that balance the way other people protect a child. I knew that already. What I didn't yet know was how far they'd go to keep their books clean, and that the price they'd chosen to pay was me and my daughter, dropped quietly somewhere the town wouldn't have to look. There was a question Maya asked maybe twice a year, always at bedtime, always in the same small voice. "Mama, where's my dad?" For 8 years I'd given her the answer I'd been given, because I believed it the way you believe a thing your own mother swears to. I told her that her father had gone far away before she was born and hadn't come back. I told her it wasn't about her, that she was wanted, that some grown-ups just leave. Every word of it sat wrong in my mouth, and I never let myself ask why. That night on Pearl Street, she asked again, tracing the seam of her quilt. "Did he know about me?" And I opened my mouth to give the old line and found I couldn't quite say it. Because here is the thing I'd buried under 9 years of night shifts. The man I'd loved, Elias, had not seemed like a man who left. He'd been steady. He'd been the most deliberate person I ever met, the kind who labeled his moving boxes and called his mother every Sunday. When he disappeared, it had never added up, and I'd shoved the not adding up into a drawer in my chest and slammed it. I told Maya her father had loved the idea of her. It was the most honest thing I'd managed in years, and it wasn't enough. She fell asleep holding my hand. I sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and felt that old drawer rattle. I'd spent so long being the responsible one that I'd never let myself be the suspicious one. Some part of me had always known the story I'd been handed had a seam in it, the way a wound has a seam, and that if I ever pulled it, the whole thing would come open. That winter, someone was about to pull it for me. 9 years before the parking lot, I was 22 and certain the world was bigger than my town. I met Elias Bishop in a hospital cafeteria when I was a nursing student, and he was finishing law school on a military scholarship, headed for the Judge Advocate Corps. He was quiet in the way that takes up no space and fills the whole room anyway. We dated for a year. He met my parents exactly once. My mother said almost nothing, and my father said too much. And on the drive back to school, Elias held my hand and said gently, "Your dad doesn't like me." I told him my dad didn't like anyone. I was lying to protect him from the real reason, and I knew it, and the shame of knowing it never left me. When I got pregnant, I was happy in a terrified way, and Elias was happy in a steady way, already talking about how we'd make it work between his commission and my license. Then two things happened close together. He got his orders. A long deployment overseas, the kind where mail moves slow and phone calls are rare, and I got sick. Preeclampsia, early and serious, the kind that put me on bed rest at my parents' farm because I couldn't be alone and couldn't afford anywhere else. So there I was, 22, flat on my back in my childhood bedroom, 12 minutes from town, dependent for everything, meals, rides, and mail, on the two people who wanted Elias gone most. I want you to hold on to that picture. A sick young woman, isolated on a farm, cut off from the man she loved by an ocean and an army postal system. Because everything that happened next happened in that blind spot, and the people standing in it knew exactly how blind it was. The mail came to the farmhouse, and my mother brought it up to my room each afternoon with my pills and my toast. I was too sick to walk to the box myself. I want to be clear about something, because I've replayed this for 9 years and I need you to know I wasn't a fool. I did try. I wrote to Elias twice a week. I asked my mother, more than once, whether anything had come back from him, and she'd shake her head and pat my hand and say men were like that under pressure. Then one afternoon she came up holding a single envelope, my own handwriting on the front, stamped "Return to Sender," and a folded note that she said had come tucked inside it. The note was short, and in a hand I didn't recognize, and it said he'd thought it over and didn't want to be tied to a baby right now. I called the base. I want you to hear that. From my sickbed, I called Elias's unit and tried to reach him, and a polite officer told me he couldn't share a service member's information with someone who wasn't legal next of kin. We weren't married. I had no standing. The wall was real and it was made of regulations, not of my own weakness. So I did the only thing my pride and my exhaustion allowed. I stopped writing. I decided that if he could send a note like that, I would not chase him, and I would raise my child clean of him. I built my whole adult life on the truth of that afternoon. 9 years later, I'd learned that the envelope, the stamp, and especially that note had been arranged by the woman who carried my mail upstairs with my pills. But that December, I still thought I'd been left. I was about to find out I'd been stolen from. That December, the family started moving in ways I couldn't read yet. My sister Bryn began calling more than she had in years, her voice bright and brittle. There was, she said, a family matter to discuss before the holidays, and she wanted us all at the farm without the distractions. Maya, I understood, was the distraction. At the same time, the town was buzzing about my father. The church had chosen him for something called the Cornerstone Pillar, an honor they gave once a year to the family that best represented the congregation, and the ceremony would happen on Christmas Eve. My mother was lit up like I hadn't seen in years. My father wore it like a crown he'd always deserved. I should have felt the gears turning. An honor built on the family's image, a sister suddenly urgent about appearances, a granddaughter no one would photograph. The math was right there. But I was working doubles through the holiday rush, and I was tired in my bones, and I did what tired people do. I assumed the people who shared my blood would not actively scheme against my child. I called my mother to ask what the family matter was about. She said, "We'll talk Christmas Eve, honey. Don't make it a thing." I started to push, to ask the direct question for once in my life. And the call cut out, the way calls do 12 minutes outside town where the towers are thin. I told myself I'd ask in person. I told myself there was nothing to ask. I tucked Maya in that night and stood in her doorway watching her sleep. And somewhere across that dark county, my mother was making a list, and my sister was running numbers. And the thing they were planning had my daughter's name on it. I'd find out what it was in a parking lot, in the snow, with a suitcase at my feet. The family meeting happened 2 days before Christmas at the farm, with Maya parked in front of a movie in the den so the adults could talk. I should have known by the seating. My father at the head, my mother to his right, Bryn across from me with a folder she kept squaring against the table like a newscaster. Bryn did most of the talking. She said the family needed to simplify some things before the new year. She said the house on Pearl Street was becoming a complication. Then she slid the folder toward me, and inside was a short agreement that would have me vacate the rental and, buried in the language, sign away any claim to family property, present or future. I read it twice, because I read everything twice. It's the nurse in me. I asked why now. Bryn said it was just good planning. My father said the rent was below market and they had an opportunity. My mother said the cleanest thing of the night. She said it would be better for everyone if Maya and I found our own footing somewhere with less attention on it. I set the folder down. I didn't raise my voice. I said I wasn't going to sign away my daughter's future on a Tuesday, because the timing was convenient, and I'd need real notice on the house, in writing, like any tenant. The temperature in that kitchen dropped 10 degrees. Bryn's smile thinned. My father folded his hands. I gathered Maya and her coat, and we drove the 12 minutes back to Pearl Street. And the whole way I kept thinking it was over, that I'd held the line, and they'd grumble and let it go. I'd set a boundary, calm and clear, the way I'd been taught never to. I didn't yet understand that in my family a boundary wasn't an ending, it was a starting gun. The retaliation came fast and quiet, which was always my father's style. The next morning, a letter sat in my mailbox on Pearl Street, his hardware store letterhead at the top, informing me that the house was being sold, that the notice took effect that day, and that I had 30 days to vacate. 30 days, with Christmas in the middle of it, and a child in school. I read it on the porch in my scrubs before a shift, the cold biting through the fabric, and I felt something I hadn't let myself feel about my parents in years. Not hurt. Calculation. For the first time, I started thinking like the people in that kitchen instead of like the daughter who climbed their ladders. They didn't want the house sold. They wanted me to fold. The eviction was a squeeze, timed for the holidays so the pressure would peak when my defenses were lowest. I called a colleague who'd been through a custody fight and got the name of a tenants' rights line. I started a folder of my own. The lease, the letter, the dates. I want you to notice that, because it matters later. The instinct that would eventually save my daughter started on that frozen porch, with a manila folder and a refusal to panic. That night, I sat Maya down and told her, carefully, that we might be moving soon, and that moving could be an adventure. She asked if we'd still be near her school. I said I'd make sure of it. I meant it. What I didn't know was that my family had already decided I wouldn't get my 30 days, that there was a faster, colder plan, and that it wore the disguise of a favor. 2 mornings later, on Christmas Eve, my mother called me, warm as pie, and offered to drive Maya and me to a place that's all set up for you. I should have heard the trap in it. I wanted so badly to believe her. Christmas Eve came in gray and heavy, the sky the color of a bruise, snow already starting by noon. My mother's call had sounded almost kind. She said she and my father had found a transitional place for Maya and me, somewhere we could stay while we got back on our feet, and they'd drive us over so I wouldn't have to manage it alone in the weather. Every smart thing in me hesitated, but I was exhausted. The roads were getting bad. My own car had a tire I'd been nursing for a month, and Maya was excited because Grandma was finally doing something with us on Christmas. That last part is what got me. Maya put on her good coat, the red one, and packed her own little backpack with her two favorite books and the stuffed rabbit she'd had since she was 3. I packed one suitcase for the both of us, the big gray one, because my mother said the place was furnished and we wouldn't need much yet. I told myself we'd sort the rest after the holiday. I buckled Maya into the back seat of my father's sedan and slid in beside her, and my parents sat up front, my father driving, my mother's gloved hands folded in her lap. Nobody said much. The heater ticked. Maya pressed her face to the window and named the Christmas lights as we passed them, and my mother said, without turning around. We drove away from town, not toward the nicer apartments by the river, but out past the feed store, toward the county road, and a small cold knot started to form under my ribs. I asked where exactly we were headed. My father said, "You'll see in a minute." The snow came harder, the knot pulled tighter, and then the car slowed, and the headlights swung across a low brick building with a hand-painted sign, and I read the word on the sign and stopped breathing. The sign said, Bethel House, and underneath, in smaller letters, Shelter for Women and Children. My father put the car in park. For a second nobody moved, and the wipers dragged across the glass, and the heater ticked, and Maya looked from the building to me with the beginning of a question on her face. My mother got out first. She opened my door, and the cold came in like a hand. She lifted the big gray suitcase from the trunk and set it down in the slush at my feet, neat as setting a table. I got out because I didn't know what else to do, and Maya scrambled out after me in her red coat, clutching her rabbit. I said her name, my mother's name. I said, "What is this?" And my voice didn't sound like mine. My father stayed behind the wheel, hands at 10 and 2, staring straight ahead like he was at a stoplight. My mother looked at me, and there was no cruelty in her face, which was the worst part. There was only certainty, the calm of a woman who had decided a thing long ago and was finally doing it. She said, "This is where failures belong." Even and quiet, in the voice she used to read scripture. Maya stepped forward then, snow catching in her hair, and looked up at the only grandmother she had, and asked the question I will hear for the rest of my life. "Grandma, did we do something wrong?" My mother did not answer. She did not look down. She got back into the car and closed the door, and the locks thunked, and my father pulled out of the lot, the tires hissing on the wet road, the taillights shrinking until the snow swallowed them. I stood there with my daughter's hand in mine and a suitcase in the slush, and a child's question hanging in the freezing air with no answer to catch it. I had been the responsible one for 31 years, and my family had just driven away and left us in the snow on Christmas Eve. Maya started to shiver, and that broke the spell better than anything could have. Cold child. Move. I picked up the suitcase, took her hand, and walked us toward the lit door, because the alternative was standing in a parking lot feeling could wait. Inside, the lobby was warm and plain. Vinyl chairs, a fake poinsettia, a paper chain some kid had made, looped along the front desk. A woman came around the desk before I could find words. Her name was Yvette, and she had the steady eyes of someone who'd seen people arrive in worse shape than me and had never once made them feel it. She crouched to Maya's level first, not to me, and told her there was hot chocolate in the back and a craft table. And Maya, God bless her resilience, looked at me for permission and then went. Yvette stood and looked at me and didn't ask what happened. She just said, "We always keep beds open on Christmas. You're not putting anybody out." Then she walked me through intake like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. A clipboard, a few questions, a key to a clean shared room with 2 made beds and a window. She never flinched at the fact that I'd been dropped here by family. She wrote it down without comment, and that small professional kindness, that refusal to add shame to injury, is something I will owe her forever. I stood in that little room, and I want you to remember the suitcase, the red coat, the question my daughter asked into the snow, because everything my family built on hiding my child was about to come apart, and it started here, with a stranger who treated us like people. If you're still with us, type, "I'm here," in the comments and stay close. because I hadn't even unzipped that suitcase when headlights swept across the parking lot again, and a second car pulled in, and I went to the window thinking my parents had come back. It wasn't my parents. The car was unfamiliar, dark, careful in the snow, and it stopped at an angle across two spaces like the driver had quit thinking about parking. A man got out. He was tall, in a dark coat, and he stood for a second looking at the sign, Bethel House, Shelter for Women and Children, and even through the glass and the snow I could see something in the set of his shoulders that made the hair on my arms stand up. Then he turned toward the window, toward the light, and I saw his face, and the years fell away all at once. Elias. Older, harder around the jaw, but unmistakably him. And the look on his face was the most frightening thing I'd seen all night. Not because it was aimed at me, but because of what it was. It was fury, the cold kind, the kind that doesn't shout because it's gone past shouting. It was the face of a man reading the words "Shelter for Children" off a sign that, somehow, had his own daughter behind it. Yvette appeared at my shoulder and asked quietly if I knew him. I said yes. I said it before I'd decided to. He came through the door and the warm lobby air hit him, and his eyes went straight past me to the craft table in the back, where a little girl in a red coat was gluing cotton balls to a paper snowman, humming. He went very still. He looked at Maya and then at me, and his voice when it came was low and even and shaking underneath. Drea. Just my name. And I understood, standing there in a homeless shelter on Christmas Eve, that the story I'd been told for 9 years, the story my whole adult life was built on, was about to be torn down to the studs, and that the man I'd been taught to call a coward had just driven through a snowstorm to find us. We sat in 2 vinyl chairs in the corner of that lobby while Maya stayed busy with her snowman, and Elias told me how he'd come to be standing in a shelter parking lot on the worst night of my life. His mother had died a month earlier. Going through her house, he'd found a box she'd kept hidden, and inside it, a letter I had written 9 years before, addressed to him, that had somehow ended up returned to the Bishop family home with a note clipped to it. He'd recognized my handwriting instantly. He said he'd read it 4 times in his mother's empty kitchen before he understood what he was looking at. The letter didn't match the story he'd been living. The same way his disappearance had never matched the story I'd been living. So he'd done what a man trained in evidence does. He started pulling threads. Over the better part of a week he'd tracked me to our town, then to the house on Pearl Street, and he'd driven past it twice already, working up the nerve to knock. When he finally came back that evening, the neighbor told him a family had loaded a woman and a little girl into a sedan barely an hour before and driven off toward the county road. He'd followed the only road that made sense, watching for taillights, and the lit-up sign of Bethel House had pulled him in. He hadn't known about Maya. Not really, not for sure, until he saw her through the window. He kept his voice low the whole time, because Maya was 20 feet away, but his hands were flat on his knees and pressed down hard, the way you hold yourself when you're holding everything. He looked at me and asked the question that would take the rest of the night and the next year to answer. Drea, he said, what did they tell you about me? And I realized that whatever I said next, 2 versions of the last 9 years were about to be laid side by side, and only one of them could be true. Maya came over before I could answer, holding up her cotton ball snowman for inspection, and I watched Elias meet his daughter for the first time in a sheltercraft corner. He didn't grab her or cry or make it about himself. He looked at the snowman like it was the finest thing he'd ever been shown and asked her serious questions about the construction, and Maya, who measured every adult by whether they took her seriously, decided on the spot that she liked him. She didn't know who he was. I wasn't ready to tell her, and he didn't push. He just let her be 8. When she drifted back to the table, we kept our voices down and started laying the 2 stories beside each other, and the seams showed immediately. I told him about the returned letter, the note saying he didn't want to be tied to a baby. His jaw tightened. He told me he'd written me steadily for 2 months from overseas and gotten nothing back, then received a short message, passed through channels he'd never been able to trace, saying I'd moved on and wanted no contact. We sat there in the lamplight doing the terrible arithmetic. His letters, gone. My letters, gone. 2 notes neither of us had written, each one perfectly designed to make the other stop trying. Letters don't vanish in both directions by accident. Someone had stood in the middle of us, for months, and made sure each of us believed the other had walked away. I thought about who carried my mail upstairs with my pills. I thought about a glass cabinet with no room for my daughter's face. The knot under my ribs from the parking lot turned into something colder and steadier, something that would still be there a year later when I walked into that church. Elias said he wanted to see the letter and the note, if I still had them. I did, and I told him there was something he needed to see too. He'd brought it in from the car, a worn accordion folder, the kind lawyers use, swollen at the seams. He set it on the empty chair between us and opened it, and I understood that Elias Bishop had spent the month since his mother's funeral building a case the only way he knew how. Inside were letters. His letters. The ones he'd written me from overseas. A dozen of them, each one addressed in his careful block printing to me at the farmhouse, and each one stamped and sent back. He laid them out one at a time on the vinyl chair like cards, and on every single envelope, across the front, in handwriting I had grown up reading on Christmas tags and grocery lists and permission slips, someone had written a single word in hard blue ink. He set the bundle on the chair between us, and I recognized my mother's handwriting before I could read the word she'd pressed into every envelope. Refused. 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 A dozen times, in my mother's hand, the same word, the same downward slash on the F. The letters had never come back from Elias. They'd never reached me at all. They'd come to the farmhouse, been intercepted at the box my mother emptied every afternoon, marked refused in her own hand, and sent back into the dark, while she climbed the stairs to my sickbed, patted my hand, and told me men were like that under pressure. I picked one up. The postmark was from a week when I'd been flat on my back upstairs, writing him a letter of my own that he would never see. I sat in a homeless shelter on Christmas Eve holding the proof, in my mother's handwriting, that she had not merely disapproved of the man I loved. She had reached into my life and surgically removed him, then spent 9 years letting me believe I'd been abandoned. Elias watched me hold it. He said, very quietly, "I needed you to see it was real." It was real. It was the most real thing I'd ever held. And I knew, right then, that I was going to make the whole town see it too. I laid one of those envelopes next to the note my mother had handed me 9 years ago in my sickbed, the one in the unfamiliar hand that said Elias didn't want to be tied to a baby. I'm a person who reads everything twice, and I'd had 9 years to memorize that note. Side by side, in the shelter lamplight, the truth was obvious in the way truth usually is once someone stops hiding it. The slash on the T, the cramped little E. My mother had disguised her writing, but not enough, because she'd never imagined the 2 pieces of paper would ever lie in the same room. I felt no rush of tears. I felt the opposite. A cold, clean focus, the kind I get at 3 in the morning when a patient is crashing and everyone else is panicking. I said, mostly to myself, I need to know all of it before I do anything. Elias asked what I meant. I told him I wasn't going to call my mother and scream, and I wasn't going to march to the farm and have a fight in a kitchen where they'd just close ranks and rewrite it later as me being hysterical. I'd done quiet my whole life. I was good at quiet. I was going to be quiet a little longer, and I was going to gather every piece, and then I was going to put the truth somewhere they could never take it back. Elias looked at me for a long moment and said, "Okay, then we do it right." We. I hadn't had a we in 9 years. Before I could sit with that, a small voice came from across the lobby. Maya was rubbing her eyes by the craft table, the night finally catching up to her, asking for me, asking where we were going to sleep. The question pulled me out of the cold place and back into the warm one, the only place that ever mattered. I went to my daughter. The gathering would start tomorrow. We spent 2 nights at Bethel House, and I will never be ashamed of that, no matter how my mother meant it. On the 3rd day, Yvette helped me into a transitional apartment the shelter ran. A small furnished one-bedroom on the far side of town, clean, ours, with a door that locked from the inside, and no landlord named off it. Maya hung her snowman on the refrigerator. I went back to the ER for my first shift after Christmas and discovered that work, the thing I'd hidden inside for years, was now the thing holding me up. But something in me had changed in that shelter lobby. I wasn't gathering myself to survive anymore. I was gathering evidence. I'm methodical by trade. Give me a problem and I'll chart it. So I started a real file, not the panicked manila folder from the porch, but an organized record. The eviction letter on my father's letterhead, the dates, the lease, photographs of the empty space in the glass cabinet, which I'd quietly taken on my phone over the years without ever admitting why, and Elias's accordion folder, photographed and copied, the originals kept somewhere safe. I called the tenant's line and learned my parents couldn't have legally tossed us that night, which mattered less for revenge than for clarity. It told me they hadn't acted on rights. They'd acted on cruelty, and bet I'd be too ashamed to make noise. They'd bet on the old Drea. Elias started driving up on weekends, careful and slow, letting Maya get used to him as mom's friend Elias, before either of us said the word father. He never pushed the pace. He'd been robbed of 8 years, and he refused to steal the ninth from his own daughter by rushing her. Watching him be that patient told me everything my parents' note had lied about. The man wasn't a coward. He was the steadiest person in the room, and the two of us were just getting started. The next piece came from Elias's own life, and it closed a hole I hadn't known was there. One Saturday, he laid out a second set of documents on my little kitchen table while Maya napped. They were his: service records, deployment dates, and, most importantly, a copy of a petition he'd filed years ago, after he'd come back stateside and his no-contact message from me still hadn't sat right. He'd tried, on his own, to establish paternity and locate me. The filing showed it. It also showed why it had died. After repeated attempts at personal service failed, the process server's notes said the respondent could not be located at the address provided, and the matter had been suspended. Because by then my parents had me and baby Maya living wherever was convenient for them, and the farmhouse address he had was a dead end they controlled. He'd hit the same wall I had, from the other side, built out of the same regulations and the same intercepted information. I sat there looking at a paper trail that proved the man had spent years trying to find his child through the front door of the law, while my mother quietly bricked up every entrance. It mattered for 2 reasons. It proved his intent beyond any "he could have tried harder" my family might throw out. And it gave the whole thing a spine of documents, dates, filings, postmarks, letterhead, that no amount of my mother's tearful storytelling could bend. I am a nurse. I believe in charts because bodies lie and numbers don't. Now I had a chart of my own family's crime, and it read clean. Elias asked me what I wanted to do with it. I told him I wasn't sure yet, but that whatever it was, it would have to happen where they couldn't control the room. Not a kitchen, not a phone call. Somewhere with witnesses they'd spent 40 years trying to impress. He went quiet, thinking. Neither of us said the word church yet, but it was already in the room, waiting for us to notice it. By the second week of January, Elias and I were holding the entire truth in our hands, and my parents had no idea we were holding anything at all. That's the part I want you to sit with, because it changed everything about how the next 11 months felt. We had the refused letters in my mother's hand. We had the forged note that matched them. We had Elias's filings and service records proving he'd fought to find us. We had Yvette, a credible professional witness, who'd watched my own family deposit me at a shelter and write it down at intake. We had the eviction letter on my father's letterhead, dated and signed. We had a clean, dated, document-backed account of a 9-year deception, And across town, my parents were sailing toward Christmas of the next year, fat and happy. My father practicing his cornerstone pillar speech, my mother chairing the garden club's spring planning, both of them telling the same old story to anyone who'd listen, that poor Drea had thrown her life away, that the man had run off, that they'd done their Christian best with a hard situation. They were lying to a town that believed them. And for the first time, I was the one holding the last page. The tension in my life stopped being, will I survive this, and became, when will they learn that I know? I'd walk into the grocery store and see my mother holding court by the floral department, and where I used to feel small, now I felt patient. I'd nod and move on, because the worst thing I could do was tip my hand early and give them time to spin it, lawyer it, soften it, turn the refused letters into a misunderstanding from a stressful season. No. The proof was only worth what the moment was worth. So I started thinking, seriously and coldly, about the one moment in the year when the whole town would be in one room, watching my family, ready to believe whatever they were shown. I already knew the date. So did they. They'd chosen it themselves. The date was Christmas Eve. The church announced it in the February bulletin and again, from the pulpit in the spring. First Cornerstone would hold a candlelight legacy service on Christmas Eve, and the centerpiece would be the presentation of the cornerstone pillar to the Offutt family, a household whose faithfulness has anchored this congregation for decades. My father's face would be on the program. The whole town would come, because the whole town always came to the Christmas Eve service, and this year there'd be a coronation attached. It would land exactly 1 year after my mother set a suitcase in the snow and told me where failures belong. I didn't choose that date for the poetry of it, though I won't pretend the symmetry didn't satisfy something in me. I chose it because it was the one night the lie would be most fully assembled in one place. The family, the town, the church, the image, all of it stacked up and lit by candlelight, waiting. A lie is never more vulnerable than at the moment it takes its bow. They picked a church and a holy night to crown my father. I decided to use the same night to give my daughter back her name. If you've made it this far with us, stay close. The candles are almost lit, and you do not want to miss what happened in that sanctuary. Hit subscribe so it finds you. Over the next months, I did the patient, unglamorous work. I confirmed every date. I made clean copies. I talked quietly to Yvette about whether she'd be willing to attend a Christmas Eve service, and she said, "Honey, I'll bring a coat." I learned the order of the service, when the family would be called forward, when the floor would open for testimony. I built the whole thing backward from one moment. My father's head bowed to receive a sash, and my voice, calm, asking the room for a minute of its time. Here is the part I'm least proud of and would do again without blinking. I made peace. Or, I appeared to. In late winter, I called my mother, gentled my voice, and told her I'd had time to think and didn't want to spend the rest of our lives estranged. I said the shelter had been a wake-up call about getting on my feet, which she heard as the apology she wanted instead of the indictment it was. She softened immediately, because nothing flatters a person like being agreed with by someone they wronged. I started coming to Sunday dinners again, Maya in tow, swallowing my food and my fury in equal measure. Dry humor is how I survive things. I used to joke to Elias that I'd never acted so well in my life, that the hospital should give me a stage. The performance bought me two things. It bought me time without my parents suspecting a storm was coming, and it bought me access. To the house, to the conversations, to the loose ends. My mother, comfortable again, got careless in the way comfortable people do. She talked in front of me. She let me into rooms. She assumed the old Drea was back, the one who carried things and kept the peace, and never looked too hard at the cabinet. Every Sunday, I sat at that table and watched my father savor his coming honor, and I thought about a dozen envelopes marked refused, and I passed the rolls. It was the longest con of my life, and the mark was my own family, and I'd learned the rules from them. They taught me that the calm face is the strong one. They taught me that you never let the other person see the knife until it's already in the room. I was using their own lessons, and they couldn't tell, because they'd never once imagined I had been paying attention. Then, one Sunday, I saw something on my father's desk that turned the whole thing. It was a folder, the same kind my sister had squared against the kitchen table a year before, left open on my father's desk while the family argued about pie in the next room. I'm not going to pretend I didn't look. I looked, and I read fast, the way you read a chart before rounds. It was a draft of a trust, a legal document moving the farm, the hardware store, and the Pearl Street rental into an arrangement that put Bryn and Preston Hale in control of all of it, with one clause I read 3 times to be sure. It named me specifically as excluded, citing estrangement and conduct inconsistent with family values, and it was dated to be finalized before the new year. Suddenly, the whole last year reorganized itself in my mind, the way a diagnosis snaps a list of symptoms into one disease: the eviction, the shelter, the urgency before the holidays. None of it had been only about my mother's horror at a biracial grandchild, though that was real, and it was the engine. It had also been about money. Bryn needed the family's assets, and to get them cleanly, she needed me discredited, framed as the unstable one, the failure, the daughter who'd thrown her life away, because a discredited heir is an easy heir to write out. The shelter wasn't just cruelty. It was documentation. It was them building the story that I belonged in a place like that, so that excluding me from the trust would look like prudence instead of theft. I stood in my father's study with my heart going slow and hard, and understood that my mother's prejudice and my sister's greed had braided together into one rope, and they'd used my daughter's face to tie the knot. I closed the folder exactly as I'd found it. I walked back into the kitchen and accepted a slice of pie, and I started thinking about the Hales, and how much they did not know. The Hales were the bank, which in our town meant they were the closest thing to royalty, and Bryn had married into them like she was claiming a throne. What I learned over the following weeks, by listening more than I talked, was that the throne was hollow. Bryn and Preston were underwater. There'd been bad investments, a lifestyle propped up on credit, and a marriage that ran on appearances the way my parents' lives did. Bryn needed the Offit assets not out of greed alone, but out of fear. She was drowning, and the farm was a raft, and to climb onto it she was willing to push me and my daughter off. The Hales, meanwhile, prided themselves on a spotless name. Old Mr. Hale, Preston's father, was a deacon at First Cornerstone, the kind of man who'd cut a son off over a scandal and call it principle. He did not know his daughter-in-law's family had dumped a granddaughter at a shelter. He did not know the perfect Offits were sitting on a 9-year fraud against their own blood. He believed the same shined-up story everyone believed, and that gave me a second lever, one I almost felt guilty about, and then remembered the snow. If the truth came out, really out, in front of everyone, documented, it wouldn't just topple my parents. It would detonate the merger Bryn was drowning to complete, because the Hales would never tie their spotless name to a family exposed as frauds in their own sanctuary. I wasn't planning to lie about anything. That was the beauty of it, and the terror of it. I only had to bring the truth into the one room where everyone whose opinion my family had spent a lifetime buying would be sitting, and let each of them do the math in public, in real time. My parents had built their whole defense out of other people's good opinion. I was going to walk in and hand those people the receipts. In November, my mother asked me to come to the farm alone, just us girls, and I almost said no, and then I went, because I'd learned that the rooms I didn't want to enter were usually the ones with something in them. We sat in her kitchen and she made tea and, for the first time in my life, she told me something true about herself. She told me about her own mother, my grandmother, and a scandal in the 1970s. A pregnancy, a man who left, a town that never let her family forget it. She'd grown up as the girl people whispered about, the daughter of the woman who'd shamed them all. She said it had taught her that a family's name was the only thing that couldn't be taken if you guarded it hard enough. She wasn't apologizing. She thought she was explaining. She thought if I understood the wound, I'd forgive the knife. And for one strange moment sitting in that warm kitchen, I did feel something for her. Not forgiveness, but recognition. I saw the frightened girl inside the cold woman, the one who'd decided as a child that she would never again be the one the town whispered about, and who had spent 50 years making sure of it, even if it cost her a daughter and a granddaughter. I understood her. That's the thing nobody tells you about the people who hurt you most. Sometimes you understand them completely, and it changes nothing, because understanding why a person locked the door doesn't unlock it. She reached across the table and patted my hand, the same hand pat she'd used at my sickbed 9 years ago while my letters sat marked "refused" in her desk, and the small warmth I'd felt curdled. She'd had a hard story. She'd chosen to write the same story onto my daughter rather than break the pattern. I drank my tea. I said the kind things she wanted, and I let her believe she'd been understood and absolved, when she'd only been understood. The night before Christmas Eve, Elias and I sat in my little apartment after Maya finally fell asleep, and he asked me the question he'd earned the right to ask. He said, "You can still walk away from this." He meant it. He laid it out plainly, the lawyer in him making sure I'd considered the whole record. We could take Maya and build our life and never set foot in that church. We could pursue the trust quietly through attorneys, keep it private, spare ourselves the spectacle. He wasn't afraid of my family. He just wanted to be sure I wasn't doing this out of the wound, out of the suitcase in the snow, out of a need to hurt them back. And I thought about it honestly, because he deserved an honest answer and so did I. I told him the truth. I said this wasn't about hurting them, though I wouldn't pretend it wouldn't hurt them. It was about Maya. For her whole life, my daughter had existed in that town as a secret, a thing to be managed, a face that didn't get to go in the cabinet. My parents had built a beautiful public story in which she was the shameful footnote. And someday, Maya would be old enough to hear that story, to feel the town's careful avoidance, to wonder if maybe she really was something to be hidden. I could not let the lie be the loudest thing. I needed the truth to be public, on the record, witnessed, so that for the rest of her life my daughter could know that the people who tried to hide her had been the ones with something to hide. "I'm not doing it to take their name down," I said. "I'm doing it so she never doubts hers." Elias looked at me for a long moment, and then he nodded, and he said something I'll keep forever. "Then I'll stand up when you stand up." We didn't need to rehearse anything else. We knew exactly what we'd brought. That night, I made the envelope. I want you to know exactly what was in it, because I never used a hidden recorder and I never wrote a secret diary to wave around. Every single thing in that envelope was a real document that already existed, made by the people it would condemn. Color copies of 3 of the refused letters, my mother's handwriting bold across the front. A copy of the forged note from my sickbed, laid beside one of the envelopes so anyone could see the same hand wrote both. A copy of Elias's old paternity petition and the process server's note that I couldn't be located. The eviction letter on my father's hardware store letterhead, dated Christmas week. And a short signed statement from Yvette confirming the date and circumstances of our intake at Bethel House. That was it. No accusations in my own words, no editorializing. Just the receipts, in order, that turned a year of whispered lies into one undeniable line. I slid it all into a plain envelope and set it on the counter where I'd see it in the morning. Then my phone buzzed. It was Bryn. The text was short and clipped, the kind people send when they're more nervous than they want to sound. It said, "Don't do anything stupid at Dad's ceremony." I read it twice. It told me 2 things. It told me Bryn had finally sensed that the old Drea wasn't quite back, that the agreeable daughter at the Sunday table might be playing a longer game. And it told me she was scared, which meant she had something to be scared of, which meant I'd read the trust right. I didn't answer her. Let her wonder. Let her spend the last night before the ceremony feeling, for once, the way I'd felt in that parking lot. Uncertain, off balance, unable to see what was coming. I turned off the light. Across town, the church was already decked in candles for the morning. By the next night, everyone would know. First Cornerstone on Christmas Eve was beautiful, and I made myself notice it, because I wanted to remember the exact stage, Candles in every window, garland down the pew ends, a banner at the front that read, "A Legacy of Faith," and beneath the pulpit, on a small table, the green cornerstone pillar sash folded on a velvet cushion. The sanctuary filled to the back doors. The Hales sat near the front, old Mr. Hale upright as a fence post, Preston beside him, Bryn at the end of the row in a red dress, her smile already working. My parents sat in the first pew, my mother in her good gloves, my father in the dark suit he saved for funerals and triumphs. Pastor Gaines moved among them, warm and young, a man who I'd come to believe actually meant the things he preached about truth. Elias and I came in quietly and took the back row, Maya between us in a green dress, holding her rabbit because I'd told her she could. Yvette slipped in a few minutes later and sat across the aisle, a coat folded over her arm just like she'd promised. Nobody paid us any mind in the back. Why would they? The service moved through its carols and its readings, and the candlelight made everyone look softer than they were, and I sat with the plain envelope flat against my knee, my heart going slow and even, that 3 in the morning calm settling over me like a familiar coat. Then Pastor Gaines stepped to the pulpit and smiled out at the full room, and said it was time to honor a family that had anchored this congregation for decades. He asked my father to come forward. The clock that had been ticking for a year reached 0. My father rose, and I rose too. I wasn't the only one standing. Up front, Bryn had risen too, stepping toward the pulpit because of course the family had arranged for a testimony, a few warm words about the office before the sash went on. Pastor Gaines smiled and said the floor was open for anyone who wished to speak to the family's legacy. Bryn began. She was good. She'd always been good. Talking about faith and sacrifice, and the example our parents had set, her voice catching at the right moments. My father stood beside the pulpit with his head slightly bowed, humble, ready to receive, and from the back of the sanctuary, in the gap when Bryn paused for breath, I said, clearly, not loudly, "Pastor Gaines, may I add something?" Heads turned. You could feel the room reorder itself, the soft rustle of 200 people locating the voice. Pastor Gaines, who didn't know what I knew, smiled and said, "Of course, Drea. This is the time for family and friends to speak. Come on up." Bryn's face did something complicated. My mother turned in her pew, and across all those rows our eyes met, and I watched her smile freeze halfway to her eyes, exactly the way it had in the version of this moment I'd opened with. She knew. Mothers know. She couldn't have said what was in the envelope, but she knew her quiet daughter had not stood up in a packed church for the first time in her life to recite something sweet. I walked up the center aisle in my plain coat with my plain envelope, past the Hales, past my sister frozen at the pulpit, and I stood beside my father, close enough to smell his funeral suit. He looked at me with the beginning of a warning in his eyes. I turned to face the room, and I kept my voice as calm as a bedside. "I want to tell you about my family's legacy," I said, "because I think you should know what you're honoring." The room went still. I didn't shout. I'd promised myself I wouldn't, and besides, the quiet was working better than any shout could. I said that 9 years ago I fell in love with a good man, and that my parents didn't approve of him, and that they didn't argue with me about it or forbid it the way some families do. I said they did something quieter, and I lifted the first letter so the candlelight caught it. I said that this was a letter the man I loved had written to me while he was deployed overseas serving this country, and that it had never reached me. I turned it so the front showed, and I read the single word written across it in my mother's hand. Refused. I lifted the next one. Refused. I lifted the third. Refused. I said there were a dozen of them, all in my mother's handwriting, the same hand that signed the church directory and the garden club minutes, and that beside them was a note she had forged in a stranger's hand and given me at my sickbed to make me believe he'd abandoned us. I said my parents had spent 9 years telling this town that my daughter's father ran off, while the letters proving he never did sat in my mother's own desk. I let that sit. 200 people in a candlelit church doing the same arithmetic I'd done in a shelter lobby a year before. I heard a glove-muffled sound from the first pew. I did not look at my mother yet. I looked at the congregation, the people my parents had spent 40 years impressing, and I watched the story they believed come apart in real time on their faces. Then I said, "And 1 year ago tonight, they drove my daughter and me to a homeless shelter and left us in the snow." That's when Elias stood up in the back. He didn't come forward, and he didn't raise his voice. He just rose, tall in his dark suit, and the whole room turned to look at the man they'd been told about for 9 years without ever seeing. I said, "That's him. That's the man who supposedly abandoned us." And I told them who he actually was. A judge advocate. An officer. A man who'd spent years filing petitions through the courts trying to find the child he'd been hidden from, hitting a wall my parents had built brick by brick. I held up the copy of his old paternity filing, the process server's note attached, the dates lining up with the dates on the refused letters like two halves of the same broken thing. The congregation looked at Elias, and I watched something happen that I'd wanted for Maya her whole life. The story my parents had sold them, the dangerous man, the one who left, the reason poor Drea's life went wrong, collapsed, and in its place stood the actual person, dignified and still, holding his daughter's hand in the back row. Old Mr. Hale, the deacon, was staring at Elias and then at my parents with an expression like the floor had shifted under his pew. Elias said only one thing, in a voice that carried without trying. "I never stopped looking for them." Then he sat back down beside Maya and put his arm around her, and the message of that small movement reached every corner of that room more completely than a speech could have. The man they'd been taught to fear was the one comforting the child. My father, beside me, had gone gray. My mother had both gloved hands pressed to her mouth. And Bryn, still standing frozen at the pulpit, made the mistake that finished her. She tried to take back the floor. Bryn stepped to the microphone and said, in a voice pitched for damage control, "This is a family misunderstanding. This isn't the place." And I turned to her, calm as ever, and said, "Then let's not misunderstand the trust, Bryn." I lifted the last document. I said that while my parents were telling everyone how generous and faithful they were, my sister had drafted a trust to move the farm, the store, and the rentals under her and Preston's control, and to write me out of the family entirely, using the word estrangement. The estrangement they had manufactured by leaving me at a shelter. I said it was drawn up by their own attorney and waiting to be finalized before the new year. I made sure to add that I wasn't claiming a single signature was on it yet, only that it existed, ready and waiting, which told the room exactly what that shelter had really been about. Not just my mother's shame, money. And then I said the part I'd been saving, the part that wasn't about me at all, looking right at old Mr. Hale in the second pew. I said I understood the Hale family valued its name, and that they probably hadn't known any of this. Not the shelter, not the letters, not the financial trouble their daughter-in-law was racing to cover with someone else's farm. I didn't have to accuse Bryn of anything. I just had to set the truth down in front of the one man whose good opinion held her whole future together. Old Mr. Hale stood up. He didn't say a word to me. He looked at Preston, and then at Bryn, and he buttoned his coat with the slow finality of a man closing an account, and he walked out of that sanctuary on Christmas Eve. And Preston, after one stricken second, followed his father. Bryn's face, when the Hales' pew emptied, was the face of someone watching a raft float away. The merger, the rescue, the throne, gone, in the time it took two men to button their coats. She didn't try to take the floor again. There was no floor left under her. And I hadn't raised my voice once. I turned back to the front, where the green sash still sat on its velvet cushion, and I waited, because I wanted the room to watch my father choose what kind of man he was, with everyone looking. He did not disappoint me, which is to say, he broke my heart one final time. Cornered, gray-faced, his lifetime of standing crumbling in real time, my father did the thing that told the whole town exactly who he'd always been. He didn't defend his wife. He didn't take responsibility. He pointed at her. He said, loud enough for the back rows, "The letters were her doing. Corley handled the mail. That was her, not me. In front of the entire congregation, with 40 years of marriage and a sash waiting on a cushion, he threw the mother of his children to the wolves to save his own name. And I understood, watching it, that there had never been any loyalty in my family at all. Not to me, not to Maya, not even between the two of them. There was only the name, and the moment the name couldn't be saved, every one of them grabbed for the lifeboat alone. Pastor Gaines stepped to the pulpit then, and the warmth was gone from his face, replaced by something graver and, I think, ashamed. Ashamed of how close the church had come to crowning this. He picked up the velvet cushion with the sash on it, and he said quietly, into the microphone, that the cornerstone pillar would not be presented tonight, and that the matter would go before the church board. He set the cushion down behind the pulpit, out of sight. My father stood in the center of that sanctuary with nothing on his shoulders and nothing in his hands. A small man in a funeral suit, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of him. I just felt the cold, clean quiet of a thing finally finished. My mother came apart last, and she came apart loud. She rose from the first pew with her gloves slipping off and her composure gone, the careful church face she'd maintained for 50 years finally cracking down the middle, and she did the one thing she'd spent her whole life avoiding. She made a scene. She pointed at me and her voice climbed to the rafters. I did it for this family. Everything I did for this family. The words rang off the stone and the candle smoke and the stunned faces, and I want you to understand the irony that finished her. She'd dumped me at a shelter to avoid being the woman the town whispered about, and now, screaming in the center aisle on Christmas Eve, she'd become exactly that, by her own mouth, in front of everyone whose opinion she'd traded us for. I didn't scream back. I'd promised myself, and besides, I didn't need to. I let her voice fill the room and condemn her, and when she finally ran out of breath, I said the only thing I'd planned to say to her, quietly, the way she'd said it to me a year before in the snow. I looked at my mother, and at the church she'd worshipped more than her own grandchild, and I said, "You were right, Mom. This is where failures belong." And I let everyone in that room decide for themselves who the failure was. The daughter who'd raised a child alone with her head up, or the family standing exposed in the wreckage of their own beautiful story. My mother sank back into the pew. My father wouldn't look at her. Bryn was already gone. The candles burned on, indifferent, and 200 people sat in a silence so complete I could hear the wax. I had not gloated. I had not lied. I had simply brought the truth into the room and let it stand up. I walked back down the center aisle, and I didn't look at my parents, and I didn't look at the empty Hale pew, and I didn't look at the velvet cushion behind the pulpit. I looked at the back row, where my daughter was standing now, small in her green dress, her rabbit hanging from one hand, watching me come toward her with eyes that had taken in more of the night than I'd wanted them to. Elias stood beside her with his hand on her shoulder. I reached them and knelt down so I was at her level, the way Yvette had knelt to her a year ago in the shelter lobby, and Maya looked at me, and she asked the question. The same one. The one she'd asked into the snow with no one to answer it. "Mama," she said, in the quiet of that whole listening church, "did we do something wrong?" And this time there was an answer, and this time the entire town was there to hear it. I took both her hands in mine. I said, "No, baby. We never did anything wrong. We never did." And I told her, loud enough for the candlelit room to hear, that the man standing beside her was her father, that he had been looking for her since before she could remember, and that he had never once stopped. Maya looked up at Elias. Elias, who had held himself together through everything, did not hold himself together through that. He crouched down too, and the three of us were there together at the back of that church on Christmas Eve, on the same night, in the same kind of cold weather, exactly 1 year after a suitcase in the snow, except this time no one drove away. And this time my daughter knew, in front of the whole world, that she had never been the thing they tried to hide. The fallout came the way consequences do when they've been earned, not all at once, but steadily, like a tide that doesn't hurry. The church board met in January, and the cornerstone pillar was quietly retired from my father's name. There was no second ceremony. My mother stepped down from the garden club before they could ask her to, and the third pew on the aisle sat empty on Sundays. Offutt Farm and Hardware lost the County Farmers Co-op contract that spring because in a small town the goodwill my father had spent 40 years banking turned out to be the only thing holding the doors open, and goodwill, once spent, does not come back on credit. In the weeks after, old Mr. Hale met with his attorneys and quietly unwound the arrangement. The bank's informal backing for Preston's debts dried up, the merger collapsed, and the trust fell apart with it. Bryn and Preston separated by summer, the raft she'd tried to climb onto by pushing us off long since gone. I won't pretend I felt nothing watching my family's careful world come down. I felt the ache you feel for something that could have been good and chose not to be, but I didn't feel guilty, and I didn't look back. Elias requested a transfer to a base within driving distance and got it, and we did the patient legal work of establishing his rights as Maya's father, this time with no one standing in the middle of the mail. He never tried to make up for the lost years all at once. He just showed up, every week and then every day, the steady way he did everything. Maya started calling him Dad on her own schedule when she was ready, and the first time she did it, in the front seat of his careful car. I had to look out the window for a minute. We rented a real house on the good side of town, with our names on the lease, and nobody's permission required. And on the mantel, finally, in a frame, there was a photograph of my daughter's face. People ask me sometimes if I cut my parents off completely, and the answer is more complicated than yes, because of Maya. I had to decide what kind of access two people who dumped my child at a shelter would have to that child, and I refused to let my own anger make that decision, because the decision belonged to Maya's well-being, not to my wound. So I set a boundary, the clear kind I should have learned to set a decade earlier. I told my parents that they did not get to be casually in Maya's life, not on the old terms, not as the grandparents who decided which grandchildren were worth photographing. If they ever wanted a relationship with her, it would start with the truth, spoken plainly to her face, and it would happen on my terms. Supervised, slow, and only if Maya herself ever wanted it. Not as a punishment. As a wall, the kind you build to keep a child safe, with exactly one narrow gate and me holding the key. My father never tried the gate. My mother, to my surprise, wrote Maya a letter once, a real one, no forged hand, no word stamped across the front. And I read it first, and it was closer to an apology than I'd ever expected from her, and I put it in a box for Maya to read when she's grown and can decide for herself what to do with it. That's the most I could give them, and it was already more than they'd given us. I will not raise my daughter to be cruel, even to the people who were cruel to her. But I will raise her to know that love without respect is just control with a nicer name, and that she is allowed to close a door. It's been a few years now. The fallout took most of the first one, and the quiet rebuilding took the rest. And Maya is older, and she knows the whole story, because I decided long ago she'd hear it from me, before she heard it from a town that loves to talk. She knows about the suitcase and the snow and the letters marked refused, and she knows the ending, the part where her father stood up in a church, and the truth stood up with him. A reputation, I've learned, is just a story other people agree to tell about you, and the moment the truth walks through the door, it was never strong enough to hold up against a child you should have loved in the first place. That's the thing my parents never understood. They thought the name was the treasure. The treasure was the little girl in the red coat they left in the parking lot, and they handed her to me, and they have no idea what they gave away. If you've ever been the one they called a failure, the suitcase in the snow, the question a child shouldn't have to ask, the handwriting that said refused, hear me. Your worth was never theirs to grade. Tell me in the comments who in your life needed to hear that tonight. Share this with the person who'd understand it without you explaining.